Well, hello, everybody, and welcome. And in fact, welcome to the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And in this edition of the Meetup, our 271st, being recorded on Thursday, September 17, 2020 at noon U.S. Eastern Time, we've got the band back together. We've got Ray Camden, Brian Rinaldi, and Dan Wilson, who are going to be talking on using CFP APIs in the JAMStack. And you could have seen the description to see a little bit more, but one of the things I pointed out is that this is going to be different in that it's our first time doing kind of a live stream. So you guys are viewing it on YouTube. We're streaming it through StreamYard. There's going to be some benefits to that. There'll probably be some challenges to that, but we'll make it work. And in fact, let me switch back to letting y'all see everybody. Hello, there's everybody. Sorry, I'm so dark. Got to put a light on. All right. Well, Dan, so you had some stuff to, kind of take things away, right?
Sure. Let me get my screen share.
And while you're doing that, let me welcome the guys. Thanks again very much for coming on. It's going to be a really interesting challenge and cool topic.
Be here.
Glad to have you guys back.
All right. So I've pushed the screen share, Charlie, and then I'm going to share my desktop here.
I haven't seen it yet. There you go. Here it comes. There you go. We see your PowerPoint. Then we see your thing. Take it.
Okay. So
looks good too.
To prepare for this talk, I went ahead and put up a very simple API in ColdFusion. And this is sitting on a public spot. So if you're interested in cats, you can hit this API to your heart's content. There's a few things along the way that might be useful to you if you're starting out with APIs in ColdFusion. So here's about 7 slides of wisdom for you. For this specific talk, I wanted to use Taffy. Taffy is a framework by Adam Tuttle that makes REST and ColdFusion pretty simple, and I haven't used it yet, so I went ahead and did it. I've got some links at the bottom of this slide deck you can use if you want to follow along later. But the steps basically were just drop Taffy in the web root and then update your application CFC. One little gotcha is if you don't have an index.cfm, nothing works. Nothing has to be in it, but it just has to be there. Then you'll create a resources folder in your web root, and this will hold all of your API components. You can nest them and put in subfolders if you want. And then you just create a component and map a function name to whatever HTTP verb you want to use, and you're all set. So the application CFC part kind of looks like this. Once you extend taffy.core.api, Taffy becomes aware of the life cycle of the request and will hook onto those things and do lots of magic for you. In your own CFC that is for your API, you also have to extend a part of Taffy. This one is taffy.core.resource. And then you give it a Taffy URI, which is basically how you're going to call this specific API. And then as you can see in the function, get maps to the verb get, and that's what loads whenever a GET request is entered. One cool thing we always do in ColdFusion is query databases. So there's a couple of ways you can return query data. There's the naive way, which you just query the database and return it. And this produces something that is terrible, and no one would ever want to work with it. So don't do that. This format does sort of save data space, but it does that at the expense of actually being usable. So a better way to do this is inside of Taffy is this query to array function. And if you do this, it'll return a kind of a mixed case deal. And we'll look at the code here in a second. Mixed case, especially capital letters to start with, are not typically the way REST is done. So you might want to consult a style guide. Some people, and I won't point any fingers, but their initials are Ray Camden, wanted completely lowercase properties. And so that's what I have on the left here. You can see all the properties are now lowercase and there's no weird special characters. And on the right is kind of how you get it. You know, if you're not a CF script person, just ignore that for part. But basically what you're doing is creating struct properties with the bracket double quotes notation. And whatever you put in there is preserved throughout the transformation process. And so if you want mixed case where, say, the second word is capitalized, as some style guides have, this is how you'd accomplish that. If you do nothing, you end up with all capital letters. If you just use the sort of dot notation where I would say b dot breed, that would give you all uppercase, once again, sending your API customers into some sort of screaming terror. They'd probably swear at you and not buy you beers at the bar. So these are the links that you might want to find if you want to sort of take this on. There's a link to Taffy. Taffy has a whole lot of guides that you can use to walk through different bits of functionality. Adam was kind enough to sort of redo the getting started experience and wrote a cool blog post about it, which I used to get up and running. And then lastly, if a lot of this is confusing to you, you should buy his book. It's about 130 pages, but it kind of cuts right to the core of the matter and will explain REST for you. So with that, we've produced this cat API, the data structure you can see here on the left. And then Ray is going to do something amazing with it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and go to him.
And actually, before you do that, let's back up and do some like introductions to give people perspective. Not just introductions to the folks, but also to the point here. So this is Dan's building of the API that will be demonstrated to be callable. And for those who've been in a couple of the recent sessions, we've been focusing more and more on helping people who are in CF to take advantage of APIs in various ways. And Dan's discussion here today was using Taffy, which is an open source project that Adam Tuttle, who's here on the session as well in the chat, he developed that probably almost 10 years ago, right? And then just to be clear, there is also since then CFML support for REST APIs just built in. So you don't have to use Taffy. Just want to be clear if anybody's watching this, you don't have to use Taffy. You can just use CF's REST, but there's obviously benefits to it and reasons that you'll want to consider it. And then also, let me say that the preservation of the case, instructs, and serialization, and a lot of other annoyances over the years with CF have been addressed either by default or in application or server level configurability. So just want to say again that sometimes when you Google stuff, you may find something that's representing the way things used to be, not up to date on the way things are. But so I'm just spinning backwards, and now, you know, maybe Ray, when he gets started, he can give us some perspective on the JAMStack. But before we do that, let's just do quick introductions for everybody. So again, I'm just here to be host. Ray, go ahead and give us an update on where you are these days. And well, actually, let's leave you for last, and then you can go from there. So Brian, why don't you get? But I know you're a big boy and you can handle it. So Brian, why don't you start with a little bit of perspective for folks, and then we'll do Dan, and then we'll do Ray.
Sure. So Brian Rinaldi, for folks who don't know me, I did ColdFusion long time back in the day. I have been mostly focused on JAMStack stuff for a while, and serverless things as well. The current company I work for, StepZen, we're a startup focused on APIs, although not REST, more GraphQL-based APIs, which is an interesting thing for any of you interested in APIs. You know, it's definitely a different approach. So. Yeah, that's me. I'm here mostly, I think, for a JAMStack perspective. I don't have a lot of CF perspective anymore, though it's good to get back into it a little bit. So,
and let's also let people know another reason I really became aware of your current role is your meetup that you run. So yeah, tell us about that.
Yeah. So I haven't been running it as long as Charlie has. You know, I felt like I was ahead of the curve on virtual meetups, but Charlie had me beat by about like 10 years or something. But
it's great to see.
For 3 years, it's at cfe.dev, and I've got like 3 years worth of sessions on a whole range of topics, from front-end development, back-end development, serverless, culture topics. We've got one tomorrow that's coming up. It's about the DOM web development, and it should be a really good one. So just check that out. It's at cfe.dev. All of it's free. There's like 3 years worth of recordings as well as a bunch of upcoming sessions.
So CFP, that's certainly ColdFusion Enterprise, right?
That's right. That's what I wanted to ask. Yeah. So tell this audience what CFP is about, because it's not CF.
Oh, it's not. No, it's not. It's basically stands for Certified Fresh Events.
There you go.
That was the original name, but it was like a really long domain name, so
Yes.
I ended up dropping it CFE.
It's just proof that ColdFusion runs in your blood.
Even subconsciously, yes. All right, so
Yeah.
Dan, now why don't you go ahead and give
So
your
I'm
perspective.
Dan Wilson. I work with Digital Primates. We do a lot of application modernization and enterprise level React JavaScript stuff. So come check us out. While I have the mic here, I just wanted to show you a little bit about Taffy. This is some of the things you get for free. You get this API dashboard that registers all your resources and even has a cutesy little runner here that you can use and see what your requests and responses are. One point that kind of gets lost is you can kind of roll your own APIs, but you're going to end up building all this stuff eventually anyway. So why not just get it for free from Adam?
Sure, cool. And just quickly, there's also a new REST playground in CF 2018 that someone want to check out. But while you're also, let me say thanks to you publicly, Dan, because Dan's been helping out in the past couple months with finding speakers and topics, and this one in particular was one that he arranged. So I appreciate that really very much. Thanks, Dan, for your involvement and hopefully continued involvement. I appreciate your help here.
Right on. So let's get to the star of the show.
Yeah.
Ray.
Hi, so I'm Ray Camden. My CF experience, I started using it, I'm going to say 97 or 98 or so. I did a little bit of blogging on ColdFusion. I just checked my stats. 3,137 blog posts on ColdFusion,
Cool.
of which 5 are probably good. And like 99%
More than that.
are
Yeah.
like,
They still come up all the time.
At least 10 of them. Are good, right?
at least, yeah. I worked on about 11 books on ColdFusion. To be clear, I did not write 11 books. I worked on. So a lot of times 1 or 2 chapters. I know Charlie now, I think we were both on CF WAC for a couple of years. So long history of ColdFusion. I currently work at a company called Here Technologies, which is really fun to explain to people when they ask, where do you work? Oh, I work at Here. Oh, like at a conference, they're like, oh, you work at the conference center? No, it's Here. It's all caps. So that when I say it in all caps to make it a bit more obvious to people.
What's a conference?
Here is involved in location stuff. So mapping, geocoding versus geocoding, routing, a lot of fleet telematics, which is a fancy way of saying truck routing. But obviously, like things like how far can I go on so much gas and so much time and so much traffic, and making stops for deliveries. That's like really important type stuff. So we have JavaScript based libraries, we have REST APIs, and I'm on their DevRel team doing multiple cat demos and presentations about their stuff. I transitioned primarily to Node.js maybe 6 or 7 years ago. So most of my work is either JavaScript on the client or JavaScript on the server. And that's me.
Awesome. And we used to think of Ray as being like Gandalf, but we all think he looks more like Saruman right now. So
Yeah, I was looking for the blue hair, man. I'm actually, if I'm being fair about it, I'm 1% disappointed.
Why?
It could be more blue. The
it's
gray,
got a tint to it, kind of.
yeah, it's like blue with gray racing stripes.
So I will say the blonde was like way out there. Like there was no questioning what color my hair was. I like this being a bit more subtle. You have to look twice and see. So yes, it's Corona, man. Like I gotta stay sane somehow. It's this or just drink more wine.
Whatever you got to do, man. We support you.
Cool. All right, we'll take it away.
Sure. So I kind of talked about my history with ColdFusion, and at some point I realized I had done enough of ColdFusion. Like I really felt like there was not much more I could do professionally, and I began looking at Node.js. And one of the things I found rather quickly is that I definitely liked Node.js. I preferred working with it. It felt like a more modern environment, but I was building like the exact same websites in Node.js that I was doing in ColdFusion. So I wasn't really gaining anything. And it was at that time that I started to hear about static site generators, and that was kind of like the early version, right, of JAMStack. Things go through marketing and stuff like that. So static site generators was like kind of like how this whole thing started. And 5 or 6 years ago, I had heard of it. I started looking at it, and this idea of running something on my local machine and outputting straight HTML at first was a bit off-putting because I had been using an app server for 15, 20 years. And it's like, yeah, it's power. I need that power. And at the same time, I had websites like CFlib, which was really, really old and still got decent traffic, but it got updated like once every 6 months. So I was running ColdFusion Enterprise. I was running SQL Server for a site that got some traffic, got probably 3,000 to 5,000 page views a month. But in terms of when it was changing, it was literally changing like twice a year. People had just stopped submitting as many functions. A lot of the easy functions were kind of already built and done with. So, it wasn't necessarily a failure per se. It just kind of grew static, or it just stopped growing. So I looked at that as like a perfect opportunity to say, hey, maybe this is a website that I could stop using ColdFusion for. I had actually built a Node.js version of it. But again, it was doing the exact same thing. I was talking to a database. So I built it using a static site generator. And when it was done, I realized that I just had flat files. And it was an incredibly freeing feeling not having to worry about ColdFusion crashing or SQL Server crashing or Apache crashing or anything else, because flat files, for the most part, they don't crash, especially if you put them up on something like Amazon S3, which Amazon definitely has crashed in the past. But like when Amazon crashes, it's national news, and there's engineers making $250,000 a year working on it, and I'd much rather let them work on it than me. So I kind of fell in love with that whole way of thinking, and I went through like a bunch of websites that were using ColdFusion, and heck, I think I had some using Microsoft Access still, and I just converted like all of them to like straight HTML, and it felt great. And it wasn't that ColdFusion failed me per se. It's just that, for a lot of what I used to use ColdFusion for over the past 20 years or so, it just doesn't need to be dynamic. Certainly there were absolutely cases where it needed to be dynamic. It could not be static files, but a lot of what I built could have been converted. And that kind of is what started my journey into what we call now JAMStack. And I'm going to put Brian on the spot here and ask like how he got into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not that different of a story. I had started to learn about Jekyll. This was probably like 9 years ago or so. So I was, not a super early adopter, but probably an early-ish adopter. But I started messing with Jekyll mostly as I was faced with the prospect of we were going to launch a new site that I thought was heavily content focused. And there was some concern about performance and things like that. I dealt with other sites that had run on WordPress and crashed all the time, or MySQL connection errors and things like that would happen all the time. Particularly when an article was like
Popular,
really popular, we'd end up going down. And obviously there are strategies you can do to mitigate that, but none of them were simple. And I started kind of messing with this idea, and I proposed it to my boss at the time, and he said absolutely not. So I decided to dive into it at first. From that point on, I'm going to prove that this is a good way to do things. And wrote a lot of blog posts about it, wrote a report for O'Reilly about it, co-wrote a book with Saruman about it. Oh, sorry. I've messed with just about almost all of the major static site generators out there. I currently run a newsletter about it, even JAMStack.
And tell people what JAMStack stands for.
So you touch it. This is a sensitive topic for me. I even just like today's issue of JAMStack newsletter specifically said I don't want to talk about what it stands for anymore because I think it's misleading. Because it stands for JavaScript APIs and markup. The tricky part is that just about any site you can say, uses JavaScript APIs and markup on some level. So it's not unique. It's not really descriptive. It's not even a stack. It's a way of building sites because there is no stack. A stack is usually prescriptive. This is not prescriptive. In fact, that's one of the things I love about it. And I think maybe one of the things you do as well, Ray, is it's not prescriptive. There's like different ways to solve the same problems. There's lots of different services. You have your choice of tools. You don't have to use the JavaScript framework if you don't want to. I personally I lean towards a tool called Hugo, which is built in Go. But even the fact I don't know Go, and I don't really need to know Go because it's just the engine that generates stuff. Anyway, that's the term came based at actually the term came from a company named Netlify, who many of you have heard of. So Netlify came up with this term about 6 years ago. But even earlier this year, they started not capitalizing the jam in JAMStack. And Ray hated that. And actually, I didn't like it at first either. But for the reasons that I just explained, I've come around to the idea that the acronym part is actually misleading a lot of people. I get so many people who come up and they're like, I thought it was just I think it's just a React thing. And I'm like, it's not a React thing. Anyway, you sent me off on a rant there, Charlie. I'm sorry.
Well, just to put it in perspective, this audience might literally know nothing about it. So they just needed to hear the big picture of what it meant. And then, yes, when you get into it, you find there's these subtleties. And one reason I brought it up in particular was Ray's earlier discussion of static pages. And what we're going to talk about today is how, whether with JAMStack-based kind of things or other kind of things, even if something is, quote, static, it could still get its data from an API when it's built to be static, or it could even get its data from the API at runtime, in the browser. So that's something that we'll talk about today. Just wanted to give people perspective.
Yeah, and I think it might be a good time to sort of walk through, Ray, and you mentioned CFlib being your first foray into this, but for folks who are kind of wondering where this fits, can you walk through maybe the rainbow of where JAMStack would be a good choice, and then maybe where the edges are and where maybe it wouldn't be a good choice?
Yeah, so when I started first talking about static site generators 4 or 5 years ago, it was always with me starting off with, yes, it's static, but, and I'll explain why it's not static anymore, because people would hear static and think that they're giving everything up. That's part of why it's kind of nice to have a nice name, a nice new name that doesn't say static in it. But I think we're also kind of going through the same pains that serverless has gone through. Like, how many times have you heard on Twitter, oh, it's serverless, but they're still servers. I win the internet argument. I hated that.
Tell us how you really feel about this, Ray.
Yeah, you're right. And you're also wait, what can I say on this? What's allowed on this podcast?
PG.
I just won't say it. You're right, but you're also a dash. But yeah, so like any technology, you have to be careful not to promote it as, yes, you want to use this all the time. So I think JAMStack absolutely has its places where it's useful and where it's not useful. Like other technologies, like serverless cloud, whatever, it's not going to be crystal clear. There won't be a hard and fast line where you must use an app server or you must use JAMStack. So in general, kind of where I draw the lines is look at the dynamic aspects of your website and how often they're changing. If they're not changing very often, then JAMStack certainly makes sense, with the caveat that, again, that you can definitely have dynamic data within your site. So, that's also not a hard and fast line. if you are looking at minimizing your dependencies, so you don't want to run a web server in production, I should say, you don't want to run an app server in production, you don't want to run a database server in production, you want to have that behind the firewall, for example, then JAMStack is perfect, because for that it's files and a web server of some sort. If you, Brian, help me out here. I mean, again, it's not.
Yeah, there's no. I mean, I think Ray and I are working on a new book on this topic, and I had to kind of come up with, well, how do I define when to advise you to do this? And when we wrote the first book, what was it, 3 years ago, 4 years ago? I can't losing track. It was an easy line to say, like, okay, if your site is constantly updating, if you're, and things like that, then it's probably not the best choice. Now I like to say, like, for instance, if you have like a lot of user-generated content that's constantly updated, this is going to be a little bit more difficult. Like, you could do it. I think the balance is, can it be done with JAMStack? Almost pretty much anything can be done with JAMStack. Is it going to be more difficult to do it in JAMStack?
Yeah.
Because there's so many dynamic things going on that, like, I'm now, I've basically made it more complex, and then, that's where I kind of draw the line. But I tend towards static first thinking, right? Like, as I lean towards, I probably can do this with JAMStack, and then kind of work to see if, work my way backwards. If I come to the conclusion that it's going to be too complicated, okay, maybe we just need server rendering for this. But to add to that whole mess, you now can combine the two very, very easily. There are frameworks like Next.js and things that are specifically designed to, like, okay, these routes are all statically generated at build time, and these routes are all server rendered, and so that even adds to the complication, where you can now mix and match the two pieces without any problems.
Quite a while ago, we went to a meetup in town by this wireless company called Republic Wireless. I want to say it was about 8 years ago, but my memory gets hazy. And they had actually built, like, the problem they were trying to solve is the people who were responsible for the cellular phones and their attributes and prices and such were product people. They weren't developer people. And what they wanted to do was build a site that could scale well. And they ended up writing their own, what essentially became a static site generator. And the product people would put content in this contentful sort of some kind of SaaS thing where you can just describe what data should be and people can fill it out. And then they would basically pull in this data, render it all into static sites, and you could perform all the e-commerce transactions that you would expect on this site. It was just all done through JavaScript and API calls. And their point was much what you were making is, A, there's really no way to hack HTML files, like there's no security vulnerabilities. And then B, if they were hit with a sale and they got flooded, the site would scale fine because it's just serving up static sites. And then C, they were able to create these APIs for their e-commerce and extend it wherever they wanted. At the same time, they weren't losing any user interactivity on the site. And I thought that was a really interesting use case.
Yeah. 4 years ago, I would have said e-commerce would have been one of those things that probably not. And then now it's like they just had, last week, Netlify just had a whole headless e-commerce summit. So basically, it is now a trend to move. A lot of these sites are moving towards using JAMStack and static site generators to run an e-commerce site and not missing out on any functionality. So it is kind of amazing how quickly things have changed.
And we should note that some of that is moved to serverless. And I just want to point out, CF 2020 is adding support for serverless. Pete Freitag's work with the Fuseless project has added serverless via Lucy. So serverless isn't also a dead end for ColdFusion either, if that's a way that some conversations might go. Hey, before we jump in with any more comment, let me just throw in that Dan Card asked a question, and I'll let you guys address it. Would a React app using an API be considered part of the JAMStack?
I'll take that one if you. Because I have strong opinions on this topic as well. It's basically that No, I mean, I think there's a fine line that you draw here in the end, and that's why another reason why I don't like the Jam, like to define the Jam thing, because it doesn't have the static site generator. So if you're not using a static site generator, you're probably not doing JAMStack, in my opinion, because otherwise you end up lumping any React site that's calling APIs.
Sounds like another book between the two of you guys.
Do it.
I'm gonna
Yeah.
argue with you on that.
Do it.
And then take it away, Ray. It's a good time.
It's so I'm gonna argue because I think like if we define JAMStack as a way to deploy or a way to build a site such that it's just flat files, and it's still interactive because it's using JavaScript or it's using serverless, but the end result is flat files, no dependencies, then I can open an editor like Dreamweaver, make an HTML file, and consider that a static website and make use of APIs. And just because I didn't use a generator should not stop me from considering that to be JAMStack. And like if I were to take a site that was ColdFusion based, rebuild it using Vue.js and make like a single page application, but my end result is HTML and JavaScript and I'm calling APIs, why not call that a JAMStack result?
Because I think JAMStack is not about the end result per se. It's not the static end result. That's why, like I said, it's not even really a stack. It's a methodology. It's an architecture. It's more about the whole process of building a JAMStack site, of like, the build process, using markup, using a static site generator. All of that is wrapped into the concept of how JAMStack works. So I agree with you. You end up with the same net benefits of a JAMStack app if you just go with static files that you hand created. The difference being you haven't actually you haven't used the JAMStack methodology. You just kind of you've replicated the end results. So that's where I draw the distinction, just because I find if we get too loose with the definition, then what does JAMStack even mean, right?
But all right, so by that token though, like when I use Vue.js and I'm using the CLI, I have markup. Like I have single file components that has markup in it, and I'm using a process to generate flat files. It's generating a SPA essentially. I mean, yeah. On one hand, I agree with you. Like if you get too loosey-goosey, then it's crazy. But on the other hand, like if I'm using the Vue CLI, a lot of what we would talk about at like a JAMStack meetup, like how to add search or how to use serverless to add APIs in, that would absolutely still apply to me. And I wouldn't want someone who's only using the Vue CLI to feel like they don't belong. Not to say excluding, but not to feel that they couldn't get benefit from like looking at our book. And when we talk about form processing and sending emails, stuff like that, that would certainly still apply to somebody doing a Vue SPA, right?
Yeah, a lot of the same things apply. Yes, definitely. I think it's a fuzzy line. And like I said, the reason I draw the distinction is to try and make the term itself feel to me a little bit more like, give it a little bit more definition, and partly because of the confusion I've seen when I talk to people about it, and even that's even where you start getting into, okay, well then just React is JAMStack, and I'm like, and then confusing the whole SPA concept with JAMStack, and those two melding in a way that I'm like, no, that's not really where yes, you can do some of the same things. The net result can be the same if you follow some of the same general practices, but I feel like without having that whole process involving the static site generator, the markup, the deploying to a CDN, the so on and so forth, like all of those pieces make this a more defined concept. But again, it's I'm not the authority on it, right? I guess.
You guys just
Yes.
wrote a book, that's all. Well, hey, let's put some meat on the bones. And Ray, you had some stuff that you were prepared to show, and that was going to integrate with an API that Dan had written. Let's go ahead and switch to that. And by the way, for those that maybe came in a little bit late, in the first couple minutes, Dan had jumped into showing the API that he was building. He happened to build it in Taffy, which is an open source implementation of REST for CFML. But you could do it with any REST-based CFML or other things. But yeah, go ahead, Ray, and take it away with what you were going to show.
Yeah, let me do a little bit of cleanup here real quick. So one of the things I want to point out is, when you are using a static site generator, there's over 400 of them, and they're very opinionated. So I've gone through 3 or 4 of them that, for a little while, like, this one's my favorite and I love it. I'm never going to use anything else. I hate it. And then there's one, like, I'll look at the docs and I hate, and I just stop immediately. So, ColdFusion people remember that, for a while, CF people didn't like PHP, and PHP people would kind of badmouth CF, and CF and PHP do the exact same thing, but they have different ways of doing it. So if you did not like CF syntax, you were fine, because you could use PHP or Node or ASP, whatever. With the JAMStack and static site generators, if you don't like the way one thinks or the way it operates, that's fine, because you have, again, 400 different options to pick from. I have used primarily Hugo, Jekyll, and 11 now. Each had its own strengths. So Hugo, for example, was very fast. So my blog currently has around 6,200 blog posts total. And one of the issues I ran into is that when I would generate a static version of my blog, it could take about half an hour. Now that sounds horrible, but at the same time, that was actually fine. If I blog once a day and it takes a half hour and my site's not down at all, it just magically updates, I'm fine if it takes a half hour, whatever. But Hugo would do it in 10 seconds or so. But I'm trying to be diplomatic. I did not like the way that Hugo did stuff. That's not saying Hugo is wrong.
Hang on, let me tweet that. Hugo is wrong - Ray Camden. Got it.
I had a disagreement with how Hugo did certain things, and it was painful at times. So Jekyll, I really liked, and Jekyll worked great for me. The issue is that Jekyll runs on Ruby, and Ruby on Windows was painful. It's a little bit better now, but it's painful. And by the way, I'm gonna get on a soapbox here real quick. Hey, people still use Windows. In fact, the majority of developers use Windows. And when you build something and do Mac only and kind of wink, nudges, haha, I'll do something later for Windows, you're screwing over like 90% of your audience. It's not funny. It's maybe because I'm in DevRel, like I want everyone to use my product, whatever company or open source project, whatever. You don't screw over people just because you're lazy. So think about Windows. Like my favorite pet peeve is when someone does a command line argument that only runs in OS X. Like it takes you 5 minutes to include one for Windows as well. And Windows actually supports a lot of that now. So it's not like you have to go far. I feel very strongly about that, mainly because I was a huge Mac supporter for a long time. And about 4 or 5 years ago, I got tired of Apple's bull -- I got tired of their crap and switched back to Windows. And I really enjoyed it. But that's a whole other meetup. I could talk about using Windows to do dev. Anyway,
it's not your father's Windows. It's definitely changed as well, and people sometimes aren't paying attention. Yeah.
And in fact, my terminal here, which I apologize, may be a bit small. I'll make it a bit bigger. This terminal is Ubuntu running natively in Windows.
Yeah, I got the same thing. It's super nice.
Yeah, and this program here is the new Windows terminal. It's open source. I have Ubuntu. I have PowerShell. It's all in there. But anyway, so one of the reasons I got out of Jekyll was because it was kind of painful to migrate to new Windows machines. Not impossible, but just not something I looked forward to. 11 was Node.js based, and Node.js runs everywhere. And it was extremely flexible in terms of how it would allow you to build stuff. So some platforms in terms of app servers, in terms of JavaScript frameworks, in terms of everything, some are extremely prescriptive in terms of you will do it this way. And some are, hey, whatever you want to do is fine by me. And I can see both ways, but I really appreciate having the freedom to write bad code. If it's Friday at 4 o'clock, I need to write some bad code that works. I appreciate having that and being able to work on it later. So I fell in love with 11e 4 or 5 or 6 months ago, I think, when I first found it. Rewrote my blog from Jekyll in 11e, and it was actually pretty easy, and I'll explain why in a little bit. And just have pretty much focused on just using that. It is a static site generator. So at the simplest example, I have a folder. I'm going to go back into, let me close these files. So I am going to make a file. I'm going to make a Markdown file, and I will call it index.md. And if you've never seen Markdown, it's like a shorthand way of writing HTML. So this is an H3, I believe. And this is Ray. This is also Ray. And what Markdown will do is basically convert this to HTML. So this will be automatically be paragraphs. If I wanted to do an ordered list of things I like, it would be, you know, hope you're sensing a theme here. And of course, Star Wars. And so it's, you know, for someone who writes a lot of HTML, this is a bit quicker. The nice thing about Markdown is I could, if for some reason I don't remember the shorthand for something, I can actually go ahead and just drop down and write HTML as well. But what 11e can do once you've installed it, and I've already installed it, I won't show that, but once I have a Markdown file, I can run 11e, and it's going to convert all the files it finds into static HTML. So if I look back over here in Visual Studio Code, I have a folder called _site. That's essentially my output directory. And I have the HTML. So at this point, it's probably nothing more than just a simple Markdown converter, which is not terribly helpful. But where things get a bit more powerful is when you start using template languages. So as a ColdFusion developer, you're used to going in ColdFusion and just dropping in HTML code, right? So please don't laugh at me. I'm a little bit rusty on my ColdFusion. But we could do stuff like this, right? My name is Ray, and you see a hello. And we know that when we run ColdFusion, it's going to look at this template. It's going to ignore the simple HTML, and it's going to look for the tokens that are essentially its template language. In this case, _CF something. And it's going to assign a variable, and it's going to allow me to output that variable. Over many, many, many years, we've had the same technology in JavaScript as well. So if you've ever used JavaScript to output something to a web page and had a lot of HTML, it can be a bit messy to generate that output. And template languages allow you to write code that really looks super similar to ColdFusion, but that gets parsed and output as just HTML. 11e supports something like 8 or 9 different template languages. One of those is a language called Liquid, which is the same language that Jekyll used. So part of what made me excited about 11e coming from Jekyll is that I could kind of reuse the language and the skills that I already had. If you've never seen Liquid before, I'm going to make a new file, and I'm going to call it ray.liquid. And I am just going to create a variable using liquid markup. And we'll say hello name. And again, if you've never seen Liquid before, this is super similar to CF syntax. You know, instead of using the pound and CF output, I'm using bracket. Liquid makes me do a bit more work when I'm doing logic, which in this case, you know, making a variable. But you know, once I've learned those rules, I can save this, and I'm going to run 11e again. And my output now is going to include a Ray file. And in there, I have straight HTML. So it's almost like ray.liquid is like ray.cf or ray.cfm, I should say. Yes, I am that rusty with ColdFusion. Typically, when I'm using 11e, and pretty much every static site generator supports this, I don't want to keep looking at an output folder. I want to actually fire up a server. And for 11e, that is 11e space -- serve. And now I can open up my browser and go to localhost 8080 and see my markdown. And if I were to edit that markdown and say, you know, I don't just like beer, cats, and Star Wars. I also like G.I. Joe, and I like Star Trek, and my wife is getting me into wine. I could save this, I could reload, and I'll make that a bit bigger as well. And that Ray file is right here. So locally, like right now, I have something that's like ColdFusion. You know, I could add more logic, I could add more stuff. But what I'm getting out from this is going to be just HTML, which is pretty nice. And I see the picture of Sarma.
Ray is looking into the future. I really didn't mean for that to come up immediately. I thought it would add it to be picked later, and I was going to pick it later. But yeah, wasn't that kind of, for those who didn't get the joke earlier about Ray as Saruman, it's pretty strong resemblance. But go ahead, sorry.
No, it's all right. I'm totally thrown now.
Sorry.
No, it's totally fine. So, at a basic level, like I'm done. So there's definitely more features. I'm gonna show up just like 1 or 2 more features in a second. But I have a dynamic template language that's a bit like ColdFusion. I have data. I have a way to use Markdown, and I'm outputting HTML. I could literally then just take that folder and put it up on Amazon S3. That would be a manual process. Maybe I FTP to S3 or drag and drop via some visual tool. But what's nice is that with the JAMStack getting so popular, there's a multiple different services out there that are all about, let us deploy your code. So Netlify, for example, allows you to deploy via a command line tool. It allows you to deploy from GitHub. So when I write a new blog post, like I did this morning, for example, I made a new Markdown file. I wrote my wonderful, amazing content, and I committed to GitHub, and that was it. So Netlify monitors that repository. It saw the change. It ran basically 11e. That's the command line program, and it knows that 11e by itself will generate HTML. It did all that for me. When 11e was done, it takes about, I think, 3 minutes or so. When it recognized it was done, at that point, it did an atomic copy of my website over, such that during that couple of minutes that I was building, nothing was broken on my site. It was still fine. And if something had gone wrong with 11e, it would have just stopped. My site would still be fine. But once the the flat HTML is done, it deployed it out. It put it on a CDN, everything for me automatically, and I didn't have to lift a finger. And if something were to go wrong with Netlify itself, they are going to fix it. Versus what I used to have, with a virtual private server with ColdFusion, if CF crashed or if SQL Server crashed or Apache had some issue, that was on me to go in and fix, typically on the weekend, because that's when things crash. I'll also say, like, I used WordPress for a while, and WordPress is a beautiful blogging platform, but if you look at it, it crashes. It's one of those things where, like, a butterfly in Africa flaps its wing and WordPress crashes. I was on WordPress for like 3 months before I went JAMStack, because I could not keep WordPress running. And that could be totally me. Obviously, WordPress is extremely successful, but for me, it just wasn't that great. Let me show just a couple more things with 11e, a couple more features that are pretty standard. Most static site generators will use something that's called front matter, and it's basically metadata on top, where I'll use a marker of some sort. In this case, it's 3 dashes. I got 3 dashes there and 3 dashes there. And I could assign metadata for my file. So if I want to put a title all about Ray, essentially what happens is that when 11e runs, or any static site generator, it takes that value, title, and the actual string associated with it, and it associates it with this page. So I could do something like this page's title is title, and I could actually look at my output and see that it shows up. Where things get a bit more interesting is when we start working with layouts. So for Alevany, if I assign a value for layout, it's going to look in a folder called _includes. And again, this is just the way Alevany does it. Other engines will have a folder called layouts or something similar to that. I can go into includes and make a new file called main.liquid. And I could start writing HTML to make a proper HTML website. And I'm going to do this. Quick little bit of markup and body tag. Default, Alevany will take your page content and put it into a variable called content. And I'm going to go old school, see if this still works, and basically assign a color. Yes, that should be CSS. I like that the JAMStack lets me write very old Web 1.0 code if I want to.
Bling tag for the win.
Yeah, let's see if it works. Yes. HTML is very backwards compatible. So now I can go in and to my Markdown file as well and do the same thing. So title, the home page, layout, main, and save it. And we go back, reload. Alevany actually has hot reload, which basically means it will look for file changes and reload your browser automatically. It doesn't work until you have a full HTML page. So now that I've added a layout and I have a head tag and a body tag, in theory, I could fix that typo that's bugging me, lowercase, and I'll tab back, and it reloaded automatically.
Boom.
Any questions about that before I actually use the awesome API that Dan set up?
Make sure everyone's prepared for the awesomeness.
While we wait for that potential question, I will get rid of that horrible color. Let's get rid of it. Much better. Cool. All right, so I want to have a website that's using JAMStack because I want to deploy in the simplest way possible. I want to know that it's going to be simple. And I see Adam is asking about the other languages. Off the top of my head, Nunchucks, Jade, EJS. EJS is a bit like a classic ASP, but instead of me just kind of making stuff up, I will go into the docs. And
there you go. It was right there.
Yeah, EJS handlebars.
Pug. Pug is the new name of Jade, by the way, if you didn't know. Yeah, so
there are just to be clear, most of them are very, very similar.
Yeah.
So it's I also like Liquid partly because it felt like it was easy to use, but they all end up being quite similar. Other than maybe Pug, which sucks.
Yeah, I hate Jade. I hate Pug. One thing I'll mention is that I talked about how different platforms can be very strict about what they allow. Handlebars, which was like the first template language I looked at, it's a bit strict in terms of how much logic you're allowed to do on the page, and they have a reason for that because they want your view, what your HTML is. They want that to be simple. They don't want you writing a bunch of code with your HTML. That's a way of thinking that colors how handlebars works. Liquid is a bit more free. EJS is extremely free. If you've ever seen classic ASP or even PHP, EJS is a lot like that. It's ugly as sin. But what I love about Alevany is that I use Liquid for my entire blog. And there was one page, my stats page, where I needed to do some crazy stat generation type stuff. Liquid would not have supported that. So for that one page, I just used EJS. And I hated myself while doing it. I didn't like the language, but it got the job done. my end result is still just HTML. So I'm fine with some ugly code being on the the JAMStack side or being on the source side and not being on the result side, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's good. So you can use whatever language you want on any page as long as it makes sense to you.
Yeah, and I obviously don't say I'm going to build a site. I'm going to use every single language. Like, yeah, don't do that. So like I committed to using Liquid for my blog, and the exception was like 1 page. So I'm only going to switch from Liquid if it makes sense to, and again, it'll be the exception.
Sure.
And 11D is just one implementation approach. There are others.
Yeah.
And I assume people can read your book. You guys, what was the title of the book?
Oh, we're still writing it.
Yeah, it's not done yet.
Okay, cool.
Early access will be out maybe in another couple of months. Or
And what is the title for people to look for it?
Working with the JAMStack, isn't it? Or no, what do we call it? God, we don't even know.
Yeah, I'm not sure what we're allowed to say. I keep meaning to ask our editor if we're allowed to talk about it.
Yeah, I think it was called "What the JAMStack Really Stands For," definitively.
It's called Saruman on the JAMStack.
There you go. Well, listen, Brett. So Dan, would you show something now, or is it just time for Ray to call into it?
Let Ray do his thing here. I think he's going to grab some data and put it on the page, which will close the loop for some folks here.
Yes.
So
and it's okay if we
Dan
go a little bit over. A little over would be good.
I will try to go quick. So Dan built an API that I could hit via any network request at all. So I could obviously use JavaScript to hit that. jQuery, Vue. You could even use React if you wanted to. So certainly JAMStack doesn't care what you output. So whatever HTML, CSS, and whatever JavaScript you want to use is fine. So I could write some JavaScript now and just hit his API and render it on my page. But what I know is that the data that Dan has provided for me, it changes once a day. So I have 100,000 people coming to this wonderful, simple web page, 100,000 page views per day. It doesn't make sense for me to use JavaScript to keep hitting his API when the data is not changing. Even if I did caching on the client side, if 100,000 different people are hitting it, that doesn't help Dan at all. His CF server is just getting hammered for people asking for the same thing again and again and again. So one of the features that 11D supports is a way to define data at a global level that I can use them on my site. So I'm going to make a new folder. I'm going to call it data, and I'm going to make a flat file for now that's going to be simple JSON. I'm going to call it boringcats.json. I'm going to write hard-coded data, name, foo, and I'm live coding. So if I screw this up, let me know. Goo. And my JSON could absolutely be a bit more complex. But because I've defined this in a particular folder, I can go into my ray.liquid file and write code that basically iterates over that data. So for cat in, I called it boring cats. I use an li tag, and it is name. So cat.name. In my li tag, in my for loop, in my UL, and save, and I believe it should have picked up on that. Sometimes when you add data, 11D doesn't pick up on it, and I just start it and redo it. But let's see if, oops. Let's reload. There it is. So if I go in there and edit my data by hand, go back to my JSON, we'll add one more cat and the cat and save it, go back, and it shows up. So certainly if my data was static, then that would be an acceptable solution. And there's absolutely cases where that would make sense. So if I had product data and my products change once a month or once a quarter or whatever, I could use ColdFusion to very easily hit my database, output a JSON file, and just save that JSON file. If I'm deploying from a GitHub repository, I could push that file up there using CF and the GitHub API. and then just build from that. But what I want to do instead is actually have something that's going to be a bit more dynamic, at least when the site's being built. Now I'm going to cheat here a bit and copy something that's already done. I'm going to make a new file called cats.js. I'm going to save it. And this is a little bit of JavaScript. It is not named correctly. 1 second. .js, not .js. I can always tell when I typo a file name because code will not color code it right. But all I've done here is I've used node fetch, which is a node implementation of the fetch API. And I'm essentially going to make a network request to Dan's service. And I'm going to hit his API. I'm going to get the data and just return it as is. I could absolutely modify it a bit. If you still had the capital field names on that JSON data and I didn't like that, I could lowercase it myself. If he had more data than I cared to use, I could take data out as well. So now that I have that, I could literally take his code, and I'm going to copy and paste, go back to my ray.liquid file, add a paragraph, and now just iterate over that. Now, Dan's data definitely had more in it. It had location, origin, coat length, stuff like that. I'm going to save this, and we will go back. And this time, 11 didn't pick. Oh, I did not install node fetch. npmi, I will do that real quick. And run 11 serve again. And now when I reload, so what just happened is that 11 built my site. It saw the file in there. It saw this file right here, cats.js. It recognized that the site needed it for its global data. So it hit Dan's API. It parsed the JSON. It returned it as just hard-coded data that I was able then to use in 11 to output essentially static HTML. So again, if we had said that Dan's data changed once a day, I could set up a process where I basically run 11 once a day. And my site would have the latest data. It would still be simple HTML, but in production, certainly it'd be a heck of a lot simpler because I'm only running flat files.
You could even have triggers that look for updated APIs and then trigger a new build. I mean, I've done things like that are, for instance, you can have a hook into, like, if you have a CMS, your CMS in Contentful or Sanity or something like that. And anybody who changes something in Contentful that gets published, suddenly that triggers a hook in Netlify that triggers rebuild, and boom, your site has all the new data. So,
and that sort of webhook could be done from anything, right? So a ColdFusion app could trigger such a webhook on detecting some change data.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different ways to handle that even, you don't have to constantly run a build yourself. This is just all automated away.
So on that, and I think it's an important note is that when we talk about just HTML files, we're not really removing all of the complexity. So like my blog now is still very complex in terms of how it works, but all the complexity is on my machine. If something breaks, it's on my machine. So I think a biggest issue of biggest good thing about the JAMStack is that you may not remove the complexity, but you're moving the complexity a lot closer. It's
to where you have control.
Yeah.
And Brian, you'd mentioned the possibility of also having a JAMStack app talk in real time to an API. Do you want to interject a bit about that? Might be a good closing point, unless you guys have anything else you'd want to say.
Well, I mean, a JAMStack talking to a live, API on the client side is really the same as any web app that calls live data on the client. So in this case, it would just, I think the principles of JAMStack end up being make as much on the build side as you can. So if this content is not going, like in this case, this content updates maybe, on a somewhat infrequent cadence, even if it's multiple times a day, but it's not something that you need the latest data, then you want to do that on the build side. But if, say, you had comments on a post and those can you want to have them happen live. Those you might actually call out an API and pull that in, but that is standard JavaScript. It's not it's not specifically there's no JAMStack process for that. Although I guess some depends on if you use like Gatsby or Next.js or Nuxt or whatever, then you have to do it based on whatever framework that's built in.
This morning, I actually published a blog post where the JAMStack site was using products, and the products rarely changed, but their shipping time changed a lot. And the JAMStack site, the products are essentially static. It's built at build time. But when you hit that product page, I use a JavaScript serverless API to get the shipping time. So it's the same data, it's the same set, it's the same table. It's using FaunaDB, but one field is updated live when you hit the web page. So it's like the best of both worlds.
Yep.
Cool. And as a reminder, I said this earlier, but if people go exploring this stuff, you're going to often find this kind of leaning against using any kind of a server, and especially perhaps using serverless. And I'd mentioned earlier, I just want to repeat the point that CF 2020 is adding support for serverless. It's already available now in a beta that you can check out. And then Pete Freitag's project called Fuseless currently enables Lucy deployment as serverless on Lambda. So the world of CF is changing. One of the reasons why we wanted to have this talk is to talk about how the world is changing insofar as application development client side. You can see how it's evolving and things are changing, and there's as ever the debates about what's right and what's wrong and what's best, and everybody has to think for themselves carefully. And then I just wanted to point out while we were at it that CF has changed in many ways. It's getting smaller. The new CF 2020 will be a very small initial deployment. Don't even have to use an installer, and there's a package manager to add modules, and you can deploy it not only as serverless but on containers with Docker. It already has Docker, but it's going to be better in 2020. And again, you can check all that out in the available current public beta of CF 2020. I just wanted to point that out because it's all of this is a reflection of where things are going, and not everybody needs to go there. But for those that are going to go there, I want you to not be misled by things you may find online that kind of make it look like all these cool new toys don't work with your CFML, and that's just not true. There may be ways it works with your CFML running as Lucy. There may be ways that it works today with your CFML running on CF 10 or 11 or 2016 or 2018, or for sure more improvements coming in 2020. So that's some good news I'd love to be able to share. And anything else you guys might want to say
Charlie,
in conclusion?
Yeah, one of the quick thing. In the private chat, I put a link to the presentation. Someone already asked me for it. So if you could, I think StreamYard frowns on anybody that's not the organizer pasting stuff.
Interesting. So it looks like I can't just add it to be displayed.
No, you got to copy paste.
Yep.
Get Clippy to help you.
Yep.
But while we're finishing up here, I think you make a good point in that. But there's a lot of stuff you can do, like your blog and things like that don't necessarily need a backend, right? They don't even need necessarily an API. But any real, like, beyond blogs and stuff like that, any real application is still going to need a backend of some sort, whether that's serverless, whether that's ColdFusion, whatever it is you choose. There is a backend there. Sometimes that backend is actually a third-party service, but it is a backend, right? So, I think it isn't like suddenly the backend plays no role here. It's still there, and it's still a critical piece of what you're doing. And so a lot of what we showed, I think, is JAMStack is very much focused on delivering the assets to the front end. How you do your backend is really up to you, and it can absolutely be ColdFusion.
Yeah, I worked for a really large publisher once who shall remain nameless, and what we did is we basically had a situation similar to this. Content would change on a regular basis, and we would push it out to a CDN, and it was static. And ColdFusion absolutely generated all those files, but we shipped static files. And as such, our load on the server was almost nil because we weren't asking ColdFusion to do the same thing over and over again when it wasn't necessary. It's like, let the back end do the job with the back end and let the front end do the job with the front end. This really just adds another tool to your arsenal so you can think about your whole problem and solve it correctly instead of just slavishly following, the same process you may have used for 10 years.
But we're basically saying we like back ends and we cannot lie. Other brothers can't deny.
No, we're not saying that. No.
Some of us said that, but it's that guy that said it.
Charlie, I want to thank you for making me look cool.
I'm here for you. I think I have more gray here too. That's part of what comes with the territory.
I don't know. It's a toss-up between you two.
Silver. That's what it is. It's silver.
There you go. Silver.
Platinum. I like it. Yeah, it's good.
Awesome. Well, again, thanks guys for coming on. It's been really great. I appreciate the time. And we're a little bit over, but that's cool. We often run just about this time with questions, and I think we've addressed everything that's come up. Cool. Somebody's said a nice, yeah. And let's also, somebody's mentioned he's wearing their DevCon shirt, and we should shout out that Ray is wearing a CF shirt.
Whoop.
There you go. Awesome. And Dan's got his, and there's ColdFusion hat. Right.
I'll tell you what,
There.
I still wear, I have a CF Wheels shirt that I wear.
Wow.
It's so comfortable.
There you go.
Man,
It's like
a good shirt.
ColdFusion.
It's priceless.
CF Wheels, yeah. Anyway.
Awesome. All right, guys. Well, it's been great. I really appreciate you coming on. And I actually wouldn't mind doing one, Ray, on the subject of how, Windows and Microsoft has changed. And of course, those kind of topics are talked to death in various circles, but, the CF community maybe hasn't heard that discussion, and it could be a good topic. I would argue that I'd be totally cool with it myself, because it definitely changed from Windows to Microsoft. It's just a different world. And that's what I'm saying here, is that it's so easy. And you guys know, and we all see in the IT community, that CF gets cast in this old school light, and it's often discussed by people that left it 10 years ago or left it 5 years ago, or reading something from somebody who left it 10 years ago. So there's a lot of misinformation, and that's the same thing with regard to Windows. But of course, a lot of people that are in the community are seeing the big change with Microsoft and perhaps with Windows. But anyways, I just want to bring these things to light. And if there's any other topic you guys ever want to bring up that you think the CF audience would be interested in, CF and Lucy, this is an open forum. So yeah, let me know. I'd love to have it. And any closing words, or I'll give each of you a chance to offer any.
Nothing from me.
Cool. Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
Good.
thanks for having me.
It's really good seeing you guys. We'd love to have you on again sometime for
Absolutely.
whatever topics make sense.
Yeah.
Brian, you still look 30, buddy. I don't know how you do it.
Yeah.
You gotta teach us your ways. Must be that Florida sunshine.
Yeah, well, I don't know. It's so hot. I don't like to get out. But thanks. I appreciate
All right,
that.
you guys. All right. Well, till again. Thanks very much. Talk to you later. And the recording will be up immediately in this case, because these StreamYard recordings are sent to YouTube, and therefore YouTube will have it immediately. So no need for me to do all the work I normally had to do. So go enjoy, and I'll get it posted on the website. And thanks again, guys.
Sounds
Take
good.
care.
You bet. See y'all later.